All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and a good evening to all of our guests in Denmark and Norway. Welcome to a Zoom discussion, which we've organized in conjunction with the exhibition Objects USA 2020 at our gallery, R & Company. Today's topic is Significant Others, a conversation with Marie Herwald Hermann, Anders Herwald Ruhwald, and Shelley Selim. I am James Zemaitis, and I'm the Director of Museum Relations at R & Company and one of the curators of the exhibition. And I am broadcasting live from the site of our exhibition at 64 White Street in New York. Objects USA 2020, which was organized under the direction of Glenn Adamson, celebrates the 50th anniversary of the legendary exhibition curated by Lee Nordness and Paul Smith with the sponsorship of S.C. Johnson and Wax Company in Racine, Wisconsin, which opened at the Smithsonian in 1969 and traveled to dozens of American and European venues into the 1970s. Our show and the accompanying catalog surveys American handmade art through a selection of historic works from 50 of the original artists in the 1969 exhibition and works by 50 of the most impactful contemporary artists working today, including Marie and Anders. Our exhibition is scheduled to run through July 31st. I know that there are still significant global issues with travel, and that here in the state, there are geographic regions, including Michigan, where our three guests today have all spent considerable time, where COVID is still very dangerous. But here in New York, the galleries, restaurants, and sidewalks have been really coming to life over the past month, and we do hope to see as many of you as possible over the next few months live in the gallery. The theme of today's discussion is based on a conversation Shelley and I had about how many couplings and uncouplings there were amongst the artists in the original exhibition, and that it's one of the more fascinating subtexts of the seminal accompanying original catalog, looking at how artists presented themselves in relations to their partners. For example, my own personal favorite couple in the original exhibition, there's the catalog, here we go. My own personal favorite couple is Ruth and Toza Radikovich. They were photographed together for their entry in the jewelry section of the catalog. That's the photo in the upper right-hand corner there. But they always worked separately in their studio in Southern California. They hold the record for the most appearances in different medias in the original exhibition, as Toza was featured for his leaded glass windows and metal sculptures, and Ruth was also included in the plastics section for her fiberglass door designs. Their love story was an epic one, which we have summarized on our Objects USA 2020 website, including prisoner of war camps and foiled escapes from Tito's Yugoslavia for Toza, with a fairy tale ending and a long, happy life together. And now I would like to introduce our artists today, who are together live in their studio. Marie Herwald Hermann currently resides in Chicago and Copenhagen. She is chairman of the ceramics department at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Marie has a solo exhibition opening up a week from tomorrow, May 8th, at the Rays Finn Gallery in Detroit, titled, "And the Walls Became the World All Around." And I'm sure we'll be looking at some of her new work at some point today. Typically poised on modest shelves, her ceramic objects sit in serene, self-confident perfection, or wiggle themselves into amorphous blobs as if evading attention. Taken together, they assemble themselves into abstracted still life sculptures, or perhaps encoded sentences, communicating a message quietly but intensely. Marie's pieces are in the permanent collections of the Cranbrook Art Museum in Michigan, the Danish Arts Foundation in Denmark, and the Denver Art Museum in Colorado, amongst others. Anders Ruhwald is Danish-born, and as one would expect, he is also based in Chicago and Copenhagen. He is professor at the Oslo Academy of Fine Art, and he was formerly the head of ceramics at the Cranbrook Academy of Art, a position which was famously inhabited by Maya Grotel, who is in the original Objects USA exhibition, and which is currently occupied by Ian MacDonald. Ruhwald produced in Cranbrook and Detroit, imposing atmospheric meditations on urban upheaval, transforming entire interior spaces into permanent art installations. These rooms were often populated with semi-abstracted figures on which Ruhwald often left the impression of his innumerable fingerprints, as if to say, I was here. Since relocating to Chicago, Ruhwald continues to use clay as an extension of the self, creating total environments and large-scale freestanding objects. He has exhibited at venues including the Clay Studio in Philadelphia, Cranbrook, the Indianapolis Museum of Art, MoCA Cleveland, and Volume Gallery in Chicago, among others. And the moderator of our discussion today, Shelley Selim, is the curator of design and decorative arts and the interim director of curatorial affairs at the Indianapolis Museum of Art at Newfields, where she provides curatorial oversight of the museum's design and decorative arts collections, as well as 2 historic homes, including the incredible Miller House and Garden in Columbus, Indiana, architect Eero Saarinen. She was previously the Jean and Ralph Graham Assistant Curator at Cranbrook Art Museum in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, and a curatorial assistant at MAD here in New York. She has lectured, written widely on design and craft, and her most recent exhibition, of course, was Outdoors in the Gardens of Newfields with Anders. So take it away, Shelley.
Wow, thank you for that great introduction, James. That was excellent. Thanks everyone for coming. The concept of this talk, as James mentioned, was really rooted in this idea of significant others, which takes its name from a 1993 book that was edited by Whitney Chadwick and Isabel Cordeveron, and it's about creative partnership. Its subtitle is Creativity and Intimate Partnership. And it was a book that one of my professors, Sarah Lichman, introduced me to in graduate school. And I've just been really interested in this concept ever since then of, the romantic partnership when you have either a creative partnership working together or working separately in the case of Anders and Marie. And as James mentioned, there were several romantic partners whose work was featured within the original Objects USA exhibition, many of whom I was familiar with, like the Shires and the Natzlers, who are both working together in ceramics, and other people who kind of were both featured in the catalog and then coupled up later, such as Bob Stocksdale and Kei Sekamachi. So thank you, James, for giving me a lot more intel on that. It was really exciting to see that and see how significant these significant others were within the original exhibition and now in this new 2020 iteration. So I wanted to speak with Anders and Marie individually about their work and focus on the exhibition that Anders did at the Indianapolis Museum of Art, which was called Century Garden. And then maybe at the end, definitely at the end, discuss a little bit about their own creative partnership and how they, how their relationship as romantic partners helps inform or support their artistic practice. So I will start with Marie and what I want to do, because there's often so many images in these talks and so little time to go through all of them, is do a brief sort of sweep through of the images that we're sharing, which cover basically the last 5 years of your work, Marie, or highlight it, I should say, and then we can talk kind of about that progression of the work and your new exhibition that's opening next week, which is exciting. So this is actually, these 2 images are both from an exhibition that was in Detroit. I think it was the first exhibition of Marie's work that I saw, in Dusk Turned Dawn, Blackthorn. And then we have works from just a couple of years ago, Miles of Silent, Both of Us Flickering, both of us flickering is the piece that Marie has in the Objects USA exhibition. You can see it right here. For those of you who have not taken advantage of the virtual tour on the R&R Company Gallery, this is a screenshot from that website, and it's really great. Highly recommend it. So you can see it. It's one of the first things you see when you enter into the gallery. And again, progression into the 2020s. And finally, this work that will be opening next week at Ray's Spin in Detroit, where you have this amazing, I love this image, amazing exploration into color. So Marie, as James mentioned in his introduction of your work, there's a lot of comparison of your work to still lifes. I think I read I think it was an essay that Glenn Adamson wrote, actually, that he compares it to Morandi paintings. But you also have, but of course they're three-dimensional, and you use this visual tool of the shelf throughout your work, as well as these wonderful kind of pools of color on these. Is it resin that you're using, or plastic?
Silicone or resin.
Silicone. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering if you could just kind of speak about, how you came to revisit this kind of composition repeatedly throughout your practice, and what it means to you.
Sure. Thank you, Shelley. Well, I think in many ways the shelf kind of became the starting point for a lot of my work. It referenced the domestic life and these kind of relationship we have with these kind of insignificant objects in our lives and the way we navigate our domestic space with them. So the shelf seems to be the place where we put things, right? So that kind of became kind of a natural way of starting. Then the walls often is this collaboration with the pieces. There are often things on the wall, so almost like the conversation of the individual objects are kind of continuing and linking pieces, one piece to the next, almost like a sentence, right? Kind of dotted around the walls. The space always seems to be a big part of the way I think about work. So it becomes this kind of collaborating kind of element. So either using colors on the wall or wallpaper in this instance with the William Morris wallpaper, so that the conversation on the shelves between the objects kind of is reflected and echoed on the walls.
Yeah, and you tend to, what I like about these pieces is you tend to create this combination of familiar forms, whether it's like a bowl or a pot. Often they won't have any repository, so it's sort of like it's a little bit of an illusion because they're not functional. With more, so you combine these familiar utilitarian forms with more kind of enigmatic shapes, like this sort of armature with that silicone draped over it, or these these long, like, it almost looks like a stroke of paint the way that you've you've hung these silicone pieces behind it, or these little sort of knotted together pieces. And I was wondering if you could speak to your use of form in that way.
Yeah, for me, it's always a relationship between the fixity of the world, the things that are non-movable, and then the movable ones, right? And I think that's both with objects, but also in our lives. And I feel there are certain things, as this image here, right? There is a cylinder, which is kind of non-movable. We all recognize it. It kind of belongs somewhere in kind of our kitchen, right? We kind of relate to it with our hands like that. And then there's all the the movable parts of our lives, both in terms of practical objects, right? Keys, all these things that we have with us that kind of seem to change all the time, but also in our lives, right? How, you know, our bodies change or the world around us change. So that kind of constant collaboration or kind of conversation between movable and non-movable things. So often by using the silicone, which I'm really interested in using for many reasons, but it is also that just as your body moves past it, it kind of flickers a little bit, right? And that kind of slight movement because of your body's movement up against the stillness of the clay, right? We know that ceramics, if not broken, right, will stay the same for thousands of years, right? But, you know, the silicone, the resin, all these other materials changes, the colors fades, the materials start to decay in a way that our body does, right? So that conversation has always been kind of an important part of these pieces.
That's great. And it makes me think about, you know, the way that you address the way that light kind of factors into your work as well. Particularly, I'm thinking about the, you know, And Dusk Turned Dawn, where, you know, within the title of that, you're talking about this transition of light to dark, and you've spoken about how, you know, when you get that dusk light, it flattens objects sometimes. Just the lighting of certain objects, their appearance can change and become almost two-dimensional. Yeah. And I think that having these more two-dimensional elements with a different kind of, reflective surface with the three-dimensional objects, it just really makes you kind of stop and be more aware of your modes of perception, probably.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, especially with the image you showed from Dusk Till Dawn, I mean, it is that moment in time, right, where the fixity of the world almost starts to change, right, where kind of our perceptions of what is three-dimensional or even real start to change. Either things come into life from darkness, or they go from life into kind of the unknown, and that relationship with the objects and how they, you know, that moment in time can kind of change the way we look at a space or the world.
Yeah, definitely. So I was so excited about this new series of work that you've created for Raised Fin, because there's so much color, you know, on the walls, and then within the ceramic forms themselves, which is, you know, especially, I mean, you've used color in your ceramics before, like here we see it and previously, but to have this much is kind of a departure, because so much of what you've, I don't know, your aesthetic has been somewhat ascetic for a long period of time. And so it's exciting. This image especially just, like, you know, slays me. So I'm, you know, and we haven't really talked about this at all, but I would love to know more about how you moved into this new territory of using this really bold, saturated, I mean, the color value is just so amazing. And what caused this transition?
Yeah. So this series of work for this show started almost a year ago, when we all went into lockdown, right? And for me, suddenly the relationship I had to the studio changed, because it used to be a place where, you know, you would go in and then think about all the kind of amazing noise and colors and everything from the world outside, right? And then I would come to the studio and everything would be still, and you know, that was the time to kind of think and contemplate on these things. But because of that dramatic shift, then the studio suddenly became everything, right? The walls that we were in became, you know, our homes, our studio, our office, everything. So it seemed like that I needed to have life and noise in the studio in a very different way, because the world outside became so still in so many ways. So it was kind of a reverse way of thinking about space. So suddenly I just had a need to have life in the studio in a way that I hadn't before, because of the stillness of the world outside. So I think that's how these colors started to come in, and thinking about, you know, the walls as both something that kind of frame us, but also where we project, you know, all our imaginations and our dreams and everything. So that was kind of a way of bringing, that was just why the color happened. It wasn't kind of a thought through kind of exercise to begin with. It just kind of, it was just a kind of a real need to have some noise around me. And then a lot of the colors came. There is a museum in Copenhagen, Thorvaldsens Museum, which I grew up in Copenhagen, and this museum has these kind of incredible colors on the inside and the outside of the building. And it was always, for me as a young person visiting it, it seemed like this kind of incredible world that just were kind of planted in Copenhagen. When the building was built in the 1850s, there was rules in Copenhagen about which colors you can use on buildings, and it was kind of limestone and sandstone and the gray kind of. Copenhagen was kind of dominated by this neoclassicism architecture. Mm-hmm. So there was so much debate about this kind of ochre yellow building. And it was absolutely spectacular, but this, you know, everything around it is this kind of very beautiful gray building. So I think for me, it was also kind of revisiting these spaces where wonders seem to happen. That was outside, yeah.
Yeah, it's I mean, the color combinations that you've done here are just so fantastic, and especially considering that you've, you know, it's sort of a new venture for you. I mean, these are just masterful. And they're so beautiful. And like, can you speak about this sort of central circular form in this particular composition? And it looks like it's sort of hand knotting in some kind of perforated metal.
Mm-hmm. So the way that I kind of thought again about these pieces, that there are some of the shelves pieces, you see two of them here, which very much feels like the beginning. And then again, these pieces that are scattered around, and in a way I see them as, it's almost like sentences, right? There is the words, and then there are things that kind of make the sentence around them. So it's
like a cadence, kind of.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And on the other image, there is this wooden frame with silicone inside, which kind of functions very much the same. Yeah, mm-hmm. That one. So it's kind of almost linking things together. So there is this conversation that is going around, and it's not necessarily a linear conversation, right? But it's a way of thinking about thoughts and words and structures.
Very cool. Well, it's exciting. I hope that I can make it up to see this exhibition in Detroit. That's just, yeah, these are great. So I will move on to Anders now, and we'll again just do a quick brief run through of some of his work leading up to Century Garden, which was the exhibition that he and I worked on together in Indianapolis. And then we can briefly talk about that overview before moving into the exhibition. So just starting here in 2005, and slowly moving forward until the short Moran, and at the Asger Jorn House, and then finally this piece at Art Company. So Anders, you sent me these images to include in the PowerPoint. And yeah. So why did you choose this much earlier piece, I should ask?
I think because there's, I don't know, there seems to be something kind of coming back in the work from this body of work. These were some very early pieces that I did. Even these were just after I came out of the Royal College of Art in London, but kind of harkens back to some work that I did before even going there, which was sort of an exploration of body and utility in this sort of very abstracted kind of way, and also very playful way. And some of these things or concerns have started coming back into the work over the last 3 or 4 years. And I think it took a little while before I even realized what was going on. And so bringing that in is a way of just kind of tying that knot. I've had some people be a little surprised at the turn that my work took about 4 years ago. And for me, I was like, what are you talking about? You know, this is what's been going on all the time. But, you know, I think my work tends to sort of shift between it's always between body and object, but then space kind of comes in once in a while and becomes a kind of a factor that sort of allows these things to play out in different kinds of ways. And so particularly for this show here at Moran that we're looking at right now, is very much centered between a sort of reciprocity between my body and the object that I created, that then would kind of create an object in turn. But then obviously again kind of playing out in a sort of spatial construct. But then oftentimes, you know, as it has been with the show that we did together this summer, then, you know, suddenly a more sort of particular object concern comes in with the vases that would help hold flowers, or the seats that we could sit on, things like that. So I think I like to play around in those three parts, and so the work tends to shift depending on where I'm at in my head and where I'm at in the studio.
Gotcha. So this is more related to that objectness that you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. Well, object and space in that sort of way. This was a very compact show, and so as you moved through it, your body really activated this exhibition in particular. Those sort of smaller partition walls, tiled, would become sort of spaces within spaces. I often like to work with carpet, and for a while satin ribbons, as well as ways of making a kind of a soft architecture in a way. I'm quite concerned with how a space is being perceived, and so, you know, carpet is a kind of I think it's like, for me, like a Miesian kind of reference of how the Barcelona pavilion, how you step into sort of various spaces in there, and then suddenly as you get onto, you know, a carpet, also the sound of the space changes, and by that your relationship to the space. And so I think I'm concerned with those ideas as to how objects are being perceived as a consequence of the space that you see them in, and that objects in that way changes. And there is, you know, while I create static objects, these objects continue to be activated by the various contexts that they sit within.
Yeah. I also love, I just noticed the traffic cones that have the flowers blooming out of them. It's a nice kind of precursor to the works that you made at the IMA. But yeah,
I'm glad you saw that. That was why I brought it in.
So, and then, so you've done a few kind of site-specific or site interventions, I should say. We didn't include images from the house that you bought on Du Bois Street in Detroit, where you've actually converted an entire apartment building or a portion of that apartment building into this installation art. But you've done interventions in Saarinen House and at Cranbrook and here at the Oscar Yorn House. So might you want to speak kind of about your, you know, these interventions that you've done within architectural spaces or pre-existing spaces?
Yeah. Again, it comes back to that the power of the object to change the space and accordingly how the space then changes the object. And so this image, particularly the larger one on the left hand side here, is in the kitchen of Asger Jorn's house and studio in Albisola in Italy. And here I was making basically a play on some of the more situationist strains of Asger Jorn's practice, which he did a series of work which were existing paintings that he would start painting over as a way of sort of updating art or kind of making it contemporary again, or you wouldn't use those words, but you know, a way of kind of updating and bringing life back into something that had been stilled and dulled out by time. And so this was a kind of a gesture and a homage to that by making these are ceramic lumps, amorphous kind of lumps that have a clamp onto them, so you can basically take this piece off and situate it onto another object, or you know, in this case it's in the kitchen cabinet and the table, and by that then suddenly these objects become activated by this other object. But it was kind of an idea of creating a sculpture that would continue to need something else. So it was totally a relational kind of thing. It's similar to kind of how a hammer doesn't make sense when it's just lying on a table. It only makes sense when you're pounding it. And I wanted that sort of gesture to be part of these sculptures as a way of addressing some of the history and some of the discussions that had happened in that house back in the 50s and the 60s. When Jorn did a number of like sort of ceramic and situationist seminars down there in Italy. And so for me, when I do these house interventions, it's often for me to understand the space that I'm working within, and also as a way of sort of bringing that history back in through my own language. And so it's something. These exhibitions become extremely generative in my practice, and I often find that by doing these and being forced into these very particular spaces that have such heavy history, I'm forced into thinking about my work differently, and it forces me into often new and interesting parts of what I think about, that kind of puts the practice onto a new place. And I think, again, and I know we'll talk about it in a little bit, but being at Jorn's house really, I think, prompted a lot of the stuff that we then did in Indianapolis, because it really is a total work of art. When he lived there, he and his several partners, I think, it changed a bit. He was a man of the 20th century in that way, probably always, really, but that aside, there was the, you know, chickens and goats and a full garden, and everything that was kind of going on there became part of the practice and became part of how he was understood as an artist, as a person living in the world. And through sort of thinking of that symbiotic relationship with nature, with space, with art, with production, with everything that he was concerned about, I became very interested in sort of thinking about, well, what is the garden? What does that mean? What does that symbolize? And what does it really do in our lives? And I think that, you know, prompted then into the exhibition that we did together.
Yeah, well, that's a great segue. We can move into that. I think it's great to show this piece in the Objects USA exhibition, because it was in some ways kind of a precursor to, it's sort of the next step into the sculptures that you created for the IMA at New Fields. And then I'll briefly show this just because this piece is still on display. So Century Garden closed last year, but we have this wonderful hanging ceramic sculpture by Anders, which is up for a full year at the museum, and it actually comes down at the end of May. So if anyone happens to be in the Midwest area and wants to come see this beautiful piece along with the rest of the museum and the garden, did want to to just give a quick plug for that as well, because it's still up and it's wonderful. So, Anders and I had started a conversation a few years ago about doing something in the garden, because for those of you that don't know, the IMA at Newfields has this, we have a 100-acre park that's sort of adjacent to the museum, and it's part of the Newfields campus. And then we have this about 50-acre garden that is directly, you can see the museum building at the bottom of this map. So that's because the land that the museum is on was donated to the institution in the 1960s, and that's when the museum then moved to this plot of land. And so we have this estate essentially that's attached to the museum campus. You can see sort of in the top center where it says the Lily House. That was the central sort of French chateau style mansion that was built in the early 1900s. That was kind of the center point of this formal estate. And then you have very formal European style gardens. The museum and Newfields has been, very interested in kind of ramping up the activation of the gardens, increasing visitorship through visitation to the gardens. So I became very interested in bringing more art out into the gardens. And ceramic art is great for that because it's relatively weather resistant. And, I was very interested in working with Anders, not only because, we've known each other for a relatively long time now, but also because you have this, history of working in these site-specific installations and working in a kind of larger scale, which I knew this garden would, the installation in the garden would need because the space is so expansive. So this is just a map showing where these red circles are where the 5 kind of interventions were as part of Century Garden. Oh, and then the key thing being that the garden was designed by Percival Gallagher, who was a designer for the Olmsted Brothers firm. And it was designed or completed in 1920, the design was begun in 1920. So we called this exhibition Century Garden because it was the 100-year anniversary of the garden's design, of kind of breaking the ground of the garden. One of the central ideas of the show was thinking about how that space had changed and how, it was, land that was cultivated in a very formal way by these, an extremely wealthy family in a European style kind of country house or American country place kind of mode. And now it's transitioned into this semi-public space where we have, people from all over the world coming to visit, and it's just activated in a very different way. And so I think that was one of the things that you were responding to, Anders. So these are the sculptures that drying in your studio, and I just love this image. It gives you a great sense of the scale. These are just really big. I mean, they're human size, and you see that come into play again with your work, and just how kind of central that idea of the relationship to the human body is to your work. And they're just, I mean, this was such an amazing, because like I had no idea what the sculptures were going to look like. You had made these little maquettes, and then you were like, they're nothing, they didn't turn out anything like the maquettes, and it was so exciting to see them. And so that was just a really fun day to come up. And this was actually, I believe this was March 13th of 2020. So this was like the day that the country shut down. The last day that any of us were able to be sort of seeing other people for a long time. Yeah, I wanted to, I'll go through again the images just to show you all, and then we can talk about some individual pieces. And I do want to be cognizant of time also, because I know we're running out of it. But I doubled up these images to show you, because the exhibition was on display for about 5 months. It gave the plants that were incorporated into the sculptures a period of time to blossom and grow. And in these first sculptures, they were in more of a shady area. So you can see there's a little bit of plant growth from the beginning to the end of the exhibition. But then in spaces like the formal garden, this is in a very sunny spot, and it just like was completely overcome by plants, which is amazing. And then, you know, this wonderful pairing of sculptures coming up from the pond in the ravine garden, these sculptures that double as chairs. That's me and Anders on those sculptures, which is fun. And then this piece, which was in the loggia, the lower level of the Lily House, a bird actually made a nest in there very early on, and our photographer, Sam Beach, was able to capture a video. Can you see the bird flying into the thing? Is it showing the bird flying into the sculpture? Okay, I tried to turn it into a GIF.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's great. I successfully created my first GIF for this presentation. So that was like a really exciting thing that Sam was able to capture that. And then she also got this picture of the bird. So it was just, I don't know, a really wonderful surprise to see the way that nature kind of I mean, that was the whole idea of creating these was in a certain way, even though, you know, we were planting cultivated plants in a very curated way around these and within these, there was still these sort of unpredictable elements of nature that came into it, and that was sort of the beauty of the whole thing. So Anders, I don't know if you want to just speak about this series briefly, or what you found to be sort of the most important aspect of it for you.
I think the two sort of main aspects of it was working with an active force that wasn't human in that sort of way. I've always been reliant on the audience to activate the work, and now instead it's the plants, the seasons, the weather, those sort of things that would suddenly change the work. And make it sort of appear different continuously. So that was a very important aspect of it. The image that you showed of us sitting there, I think, was a very important aspect for me personally, to kind of get back into that mode of thinking about my sculptures again, of that sort of activation and making a subject of the audience as a sort of gesture within the show as well, of sort of trying to undermine those hierarchies that normally sit within sculpture spectatorship. And so I think, you know, as in a very sort of brief way, those were the main important parts. And then obviously being outside with this work is a totally different and very uncontrollable kind of situation that I truly enjoyed. Yeah, for me, this was I mean, just on a simple personal level, such a gift to be able to do during COVID, mm-hmm. And that we could actually get this installed when everything else seemed to be shut down. It was so fortuitous then.
Yeah, it was. I guess I should say that this show opened in June of 2020 and was open until October of 2020. So this was, of course, a period where most museums were completely shut down, or right after that. And when this show opened, I believe that only our gardens at that point had reopened, and the museum building hadn't opened yet. So it was incredibly fortuitous that we decided to do an exhibition in the gardens, because people, and And I think it was really great because, you know, it was something that a lot of our guests had really were missing and wanted, you know, it was kind of this nice gift that we could give to the public to have some art out there in the gardens when people had been really at the beginning of the pandemic just very cooped up in their houses for a long period of time. So yeah, it was good timing for sure.
Exactly. And I just, you know, I think an important aspect of it as well was trying to kind of, you know, also just make these more formal gardens a little, hopefully like more approachable, particularly because of the sort of, you know, European sort of formality of aspects of this garden. And so the point of doing an intervention like this at the 100 year was also to kind of begin to think about it in a more sort of generous way and in a more playful way, hopefully also a way that could then you know, make this relevant to a much broader constituency than the sort of hardcore European garden lovers, you know, which is a very particular kind of subset of people. And so I think that was an important aspect of the exhibition as well, particularly when we were sort of selecting plants and bringing all of that in to try to kind of intentionally also use plant types that weren't necessarily understood to exist within gardens of these types.
Yes, and I should just give a quick plug to our horticulture team, who was amazing. Yeah, I think this image is a great way to capture that because you can see on the bottom left this sort of formal traditional sculpture. A lot of the sculpture that we have in the garden is very kind of, you know, neoclassical statuary, what you would expect to see. So that interruption is great. And James, I see you've joined us. Is it time for us to kind of wrap up a little bit?
Yeah, we're nearing that Q&A section and all of that. And I in looking at these garden photographs and in talking about the timing of this particular exhibition, I thought I would ask the first most obvious question here, and that is, since this work was being finished and realized as the pandemic started, Anders, did you find that you and Marie had much more personal attention, feedback for each other's work than you would during ordinary days? Like, was there more collaboration, more comments back and forth, or did you have a similar pattern that you'd had before?
Do you want to take it? You take it. Okay. Well, honestly, it was actually the opposite. We have two children too, and so in the process of doing this, because Marie is chairing the ceramics department, her workload just got absolutely insane, and our kids were not in school anymore, so and we wouldn't allow anybody into our house. So it basically meant that one of us would have to be home at any given point. So really what happened during that time is that we had so little time to talk together, and we would basically just, you know, high five each other over coffee in the morning, and then, you know, meet each other exhausted in bed at night, you know, and that was it, you know. And then in some point during the day there would be an interchange. Either I would be homeschooling with the kids or Marie would be homeschooling with the kids. So there was hardly any conversation. Normally we have a lot more.
Fabulous. I do have a question from one of our guests here as well. It's sort of directed to both of you, and it's 2 questions, 3 questions at once. So she's asking, what is it that makes you come back to clay and ceramics when making objects? What are the advantages and limitations of focusing on clay and ceramics, and how does that lead to using different materials within your objects and installation outside of ceramic? Either one of you could start, maybe Marie.
I mean, that's a really good question. I think for me, clay is a material that's been such a big part of my life for so many years. Right? I started when I was 10 working with clay. So I think clay always seems for me as the beginning. It is a material that I know extremely well. My body knows it very well. So as an example, I've been throwing for many, many years. So when I the wheel, the throwing wheel, becomes often the kind of where everything begins, even though that thrown objects are a very small part of my practice. But it's kind of the way I think, and because it is a kind of a physical memory of a material, right? I can work with it without thinking, because it is kind of, the memories is in my body. So it gives you this kind of extreme freedom to think as you're kind of making. And then pairing that up with materials, for me, that I'm less familiar with, then there is a different playfulness and a different attention. Like, I'm working a lot with wood. I got a wood shop for Christmas from Anders, and I feel like I'm turning into this retired grandpa that's just standing in his wood shop. But there is such a freedom about working with a material that I don't have a lot of knowledge in, and I am just trying to figure things out. But then keep coming back to clay, where there is kind of a knowledge in so many ways, to kind of constantly having them up against each other, for me, has always been really important.
Shelley, any other questions from you as we...
Yeah, so I had a very long question that I emailed to Anders and Marie at the beginning, because I did want to circle it back to this this text, Significant Others. And one of the questions that the editors asked the 13 authors that wrote essays for this book was, if the dominant belief about art is that it is produced by solitary individuals, but the dominant social structures are concerned with familial, matrimonial, and heterosexual arrangements, how do two creative people escape or not the constraints of this framework and construct an alternative story? So if you have, I guess we have 5 minutes for you to
take that. We could answer it. Yeah.
We can do it simultaneously and see where that ends.
See if we go parallel or not. I mean, my first reaction to that, in a way, is to actively kind of refuse those norms, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something that we have done and are doing. And for many years, since we decided to both have this kind of incredible privileged life as artists, where we are individuals in our studios, but also to have a family, right? We have 2 kids, and there was a decision we made together. And knowing that that can only work, our 2 kind of parallel worlds can only work if they are a unity of some sort, right?
Yeah. No, I think so. I mean, I think we support each other in all aspects of life, or at least try to, as much as possible, to make all of that happen. I find it always a challenge, because there are certain expectations as to, what a sort of normative heterosexual relationship, as the one that we look as if we do, and we probably also do, what that looks like and how that operates. And so, I mean, we've done some, I think we've tried to work quite consciously to not have that outside expectation take our lives over in that way. And so one of the sort of significant shifts that we did at some point was that I decided to leave Cranbrook as a way of sort of saying, well, we gotta refigure this in some sort of way. There was always, Cranbrook made us sort of, and we love that place, and it's not a criticism of the institution, but when you're head of the department where you're also living on campus, it basically means that there is so much attention on the person who's doing that, and the spouse always becomes this sort of supplementary thing, and particularly when it's then also male and female in a sort of normative way. And I think that began to wear on us in a way that that I didn't like, and so we made a sort of crazy decision just to quit the job and then see what would happen. And for very good reasons, Marie got picked up by the Art Institute of Chicago very soon after, and you know, we are now in a totally shifted up role where I'm sort of the supportive figure when Marie goes out, and I'm sort of, you know, this sort of oddball spouse that people are like, who's that dude?
Well, we were also just talking about before this Zoom talk, we were talking about your joint middle name that you created as well. So you're Marie Herwald Hermann and Anders Herwald Ruhwald. And you said that this was something you created when you were married, as or when you had children.
When we got married.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, actually,
but it became really serious when we had kids. I
Yeah.
think two people trying to figure out the surname for kids made sense to take the 3 letters from each of our names and combine them. And then it was a little confusing in the beginning when the kids have surnames that are neither Anders's or mine.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we travel a lot through passport control. It's a little confusing.
Yeah, sometimes they get
You
it,
know.
other times they just kidnap these kids. Yeah,
Well,
and
it's great. It's unconventional, which is great. And I think that's what you're speaking to here is that, you know, you in some ways you have this heteronormative relationship where you're married, but and you have kids, but obviously it's an unconventional one as well.
But I also think that it's important to remember that we have an incredible freedom in terms of the work we do, right?
Mhm.
That in a way, we are always working, right? Work is always within our lives, but we also have a freedom when schools suddenly close down and we have to navigate, you know, one of us then just works in the studio at night, or we, you know, when we have exhibitions, we can all travel there and it becomes this kind of work/family holiday, you know, research trip, right? So there is also a huge privilege in that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the kids are just part of it, right? They, you know, they just have to look at clay, right? It's part of their world in a way, and you know, they'll love it or hate it later. But that's just, you know, I also think it is that you have to think of your family structure slightly different, and maybe it's also a cultural thing. We both grew up in Denmark, and where both our mothers work, you know, it didn't seem that strange. It's kind of a slightly different structure than I think it is here in America, where.
A beautiful answer, and that was a very serene 1 hour with a very rapt audience, mostly Nordic, it would appear. The questions were few, but I think that's because of how effective Shelley was in guiding us through this. I want to thank all 3 of you for joining us today, and once again, to all of you out there, I do hope that if any of you are in New York over the next few months, to come see this work within the context of 48 other contemporary makers and 50 historical figures. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you to the 3 of you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thanks for having us.
yeah, thank you so much for the wonderful introduction, both of you as well.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Thanks.